Good morning. Welcome to Coffee and Conversations with Lieutenant General Mary O'Brien. Before we begin, we'd like to share a video from our sponsor, SAIC.
Future wars will be decided by the side who makes the best and fastest decisions. It's a term that we refer to as decision advantage. With the petabytes of information and data that are available, the decision makers across the battle space gain that advantage by being able to understand the information, process the information, and use that information to make a decision on effects. Whether those effects are kinetic or non-kinetic, or those decision makers are in an airplane at the edge of the battle space or slightly removed in an operations center. SAIC is working to make this a reality. So follow us online for more.
And now please welcome INSA President Suzanne Wilson Heckenberg.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our Tuesday Coffee and Conversation. We're pleased to welcome one of the community's top leaders this morning. I hope to make today's program as interactive as possible. So please submit your questions through the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. We have nearly 500 virtual attendees registered today, and we'll do our best to get to your questions. We are pleased to welcome members of the press to today's program. So as a reminder, this program is on the record and will be available for viewing on our website within the next couple of days. And finally, I would like to thank our sponsor, SAIC, for their critical support of today's program. Now, I am pleased to welcome Vinnie DeFranzo, Senior Vice President for Air Force and DoD Agencies and Commands for SAIC. Vinnie, over to you.
Thank you, Suzanne. I would like to thank INSA for hosting this program. This is a great opportunity. SAIC is a longstanding supporter of INSA. About 1/4 of our business is actually in the IC or related to the DoD C5ISR mission. So this is a very valuable forum for us as it is for the other partners and attendees. It's an exciting time to be in this business, especially with the continued focus on the peer threat and the renewed focus on really emphasizing speed of getting capability out into the field. And I know General O'Brien will probably touch on some of those topics. Just to highlight some of General O'Brien's responsibilities, Lieutenant General Mary O'Brien is the Air Force's Deputy Chief of Staff for ISR and Cyber Effects Operations. In this capacity, she is responsible both to the Secretary of the Air Force and the Chief of Staff of the Air Force for policy formulation, planning, evaluation, and leadership of ISR, of the Air Force's ISR and cyber effects capabilities. As the Air Force's Senior Intelligence Officer, she is responsible both to the DNI and Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. In this role, she leads 6 directorates, supports a 73,000 person intelligence and cyber operations enterprise, and she manages a portfolio worth over $72 billion. As you would imagine, General O'Brien has had a phenomenal career. I just want to highlight a couple of highlights. She is a fellow Air Force Academy graduate, and she went on to become a 4-time commander from squadron level up through numbered Air Force, all intelligence organizations. She served as the Director of Intelligence, both for Air Force Space Command and U.S. Cyber Command. She deployed for Operation Allied Force and then went on to be the Deputy Director of Intelligence for INSA, for ISAF, got that backwards, over in Afghanistan. Slight difference there. Interspersed with all that operational experience were multiple Pentagon tours, both air staff and joint staff. So General O'Brien comes to this role armed with a great mix of operational, field experience as well as joint and staff experience to be the Air Force's senior intelligence officer. So General O'Brien, welcome, and Susan, back to you.
Thank you, Vinny, and thanks again to SAIC. So, General O'Brien, I enjoyed our conversation last week, getting to know you personally and a little more about your background. And you've held quite a few senior positions and come in contact with mentors and colleagues that likely have helped define your leadership style and you personally as a leader. Could you share with our virtual attendees who some of those folks are and what you gleaned from them?
Sure. Thanks, Suzanne. Look forward to today, this snowy day. So we're all products of our experiences, and in 32 years, I've accumulated a lot of experience. For me, the greatest influences are the people and the relationships. And so when I came into this position about 14 months ago, I looked around and I saw a lot of familiar faces, both among my 3-star service counterparts, inside the Air Force and the IC. For example, Scotty Barrier was the Army G2, and now I'm the director of DIA. We worked together in Afghanistan for, as we mentioned, a year, 2014 to 2015, a really big year with election drawdowns and things like that. Laura Potter's now the G2. Her and I served together on the Joint Staff J2 as lieutenant colonels. Lori Reynolds and I were at Cyber Command together. General Jeff Cruz was in USDI Warfighter Support when I took over. Now he's at ODNI. We were group and wing commanders together, and also J2s together when he was the Indo-PACOM J2 and I was Cyber Command J2. Lear Lauterbach, who was on an incident event not too long ago, we've known each other for a very long time. And even my own deputies for ISR, General Pete Lambert, now retired, and D-Day Simpson, we served together in 70th ISR wing as colonels. So all of these relationships and others, there's too many to name, have been built on collaboration and trust, and not competition. And so I believe it really helped me hit the ground running when I got into the job. When things got more challenging because of COVID, my first thought when I'm talking to my counterparts is how can we find opportunities to work together and solve these difficult joint problems? It has really worked out well that some of these relationships have come back full circle, and we're like, wow, all right, we have the opportunity to really shape the future together.
So you mentioned 14 months ago. I started my role about 14 months ago as well, and then found myself a couple months in the middle of a pandemic. How have you been able to connect with your colleagues and the workforce there in this environment where often, those in-person connections are very difficult to establish?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first got into the job, I had laid out my my strategy to get out and see the field. I was going to visit each MAJCOM, and I'm lucky that I started in reverse order of the MAJCOMs I have had the least experience with. And so went to AFSOC in person, one of my first visits, Air Force Materiel Command, one of my first visits, and Air Mobility Command. But then we were kind of locked down. And after a brief time, when we realized this is going to be enduring, we started scheduling the virtual MAJCOM visits. And so when General Brown took over and he said, tell me how, about your engagement with the MAJCOMs, I could say I have either visited in person or virtually all the MAJCOMs to talk about their intel and cyber requirements. Also, NASIC falls underneath me. I ended up doing the outgoing change of command virtually. I did the incoming change of command virtually. And despite my intent to get there in person every quarter and recognize airmen, we've been doing quarterly visits. And so now we're rolling out our wing visits. And that's working well for the mission perspective. What it's not able to do is replicate my ability to really talk to the airmen coin airmen, recognize airmen, thank airmen in person for the great work that they're doing. So I will be very much looking forward to being able to get back on the road and have those face-to-face interactions.
Well, you indicated your gratitude to them on this webcast, so we will have this available on our website in the coming weeks.
Yes.
So you mentioned you visited first the MAGCOMs that you were sort of you had the least amount of experience with. That's a leadership tool in itself. I think often human nature is to approach entities that you're more familiar with or more comfortable with, and then work your way down. So that's a leadership lesson I think we can all learn from. You may have one of the longest titles in the Joint Staff community, but what does the HQ USAF A2A6 portfolio actually encompass? And then how has the merger of the A2 and A6 impacted the Air Force? And more specifically, how the service intersects with the IC. And I know those were three kind of rapid fire questions, but if you could dissect them for us, we would really appreciate it.
Sure. So the A26, and that's useful because while some other services have also done some combination of intel and cyber functions, we've all done it a little bit differently. So in the Air Force, our ISR and cyber effects is the combination of our traditional ISR portfolio, as well as combat communications or expeditionary communications, spectrum management, and cyber operations. So we're the lead for our ISR and cyber warfare oversight policy and guidance, but also the functional community lead for the majority of our ISR and cyber workforce, so that 73,000 member ISR and cyber enterprise. Back in October, the Air Force Spectrum Management Office that manages spectrum for the Air Force transitioned from Air Combat Command to the A26. So that's now part of our organization. And as I mentioned, we also oversee NASIC, which is responsible for foreign air and space and our specialized intelligence. And then, of course, delegated by the Secretary of the Air Force to serve as the Air Force head of the intelligence community. And so what do we not do with cyber? So Ms. Lauren Knausenberger is our Deputy CIO for the Air Force. She's responsible for our NIBR and SIBR connections, our enterprise IT as a service, and then we share some oversight with things like crypto modernization and things like that. And so the merger. When I first took over, I did my first town hall with my headquarters staff, and I feel like if I had said, if you are an intelligence professional, raise your hand, that this half of the room would have raised their hand. And if I would have said, and who's my cyber workforce, this half of the room would have raised their hand. And so it's been more than 2 years. It was really created out of the need to have less stovepiping and integration. And so that has been our focus. It's a work in progress. We're seeing improvements, but we talk less and less about the merger and more about the integration and that focus on readiness and capabilities for our ISR and cyber effects. The interdependence of that workforce allows us to coordinate and synchronize some aspects of information warfare. All of them are not part of my portfolio, so we have to collaborate with our Director of Ops and Director of Strategy and Plans. It is allowing us to have a more deliberate talent development program working together. And then, of course, as I mentioned, it elevated the role of the CIO as part of SAF-CN. With respect to the Intel community, I think this is probably one of the more less observable or more understated aspects. I think this has really opened the door for the Air Force cyber community to better collaborate with the IC, coming in through the front door, through the A26, with long-standing existing relationships. We have the phone book, we know who to call. It has made it, I think, easier for the IC to accept requirements from the A26, because they're not coming in from the cyber community who says, hey, we want this, and where's the Air Force Intel community? Well, we're already providing that, or somebody's already providing that. So I think it's been a really good move, and I look forward to more integration, not just internally, but now externally through the IC with our other partners.
So you mentioned 2 years ago, half the room raised their hand for Intel, half for cyber. Here we are 2 years later. Is there a time where there are going to be some folks who raise their hand for both?
I think we are headed toward that time, and we'll call them the information warriors, right? The information warfare force.
Okay.
And so I think we might have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that too, with some of the other initiatives that are in the Air Force.
Great. So this is, you've been in your role now for around 14 months during primarily a pandemic. And so I'm sure you have a jam-packed schedule with virtual, and then from time to time, I know you mentioned you've had the opportunity to travel where appropriate. But as far as any books, podcasts, shows, anything that you are indulging in your downtime that you can share with our virtual attendees?
Well, I mean, like everybody else, there's a certain amount of Netflix binging that goes on, and I have a 20-year-old daughter and a 17-year-old son that are trying to help keep me current with pop culture. But what I'd like to share that I'm reading right now, again, because I had an opportunity to preview, there's really two important things. One, I'd like to put a plug out there for the Air and Space Power Journal Winter Edition. That is our special edition on information warfare. So that just came out. There's some great thinking in there about information warfare. So some great articles by some of our senior leaders, General Kelly, the commander of ACC, but also some really good thinking from some of our company grade officers and our younger workforce. How to restructure information warfare in the US. Another one, empowering the information warrior. Identifying faulty assumption information warfare. So there's a bunch of articles there, and I'd like to recommend that as perhaps, kind of a primer on some of the thinking information warfare. The other book that I read and finished earlier in January, but the timing aligns with the SecDef memo. Secretary Austin's one of his first memos that came out on the 23rd of January, which is combating sexual assault and harassment in the Air Force. I had just had the opportunity to read Know My Name by Chantel Miller, and that is a book. It is a very powerful description of what it's like for a sexual assault victim to seek justice, even if the assailants were caught in the act. Some of you may be familiar with her. Originally, she went through the court system as Emily Doe and wrote a very powerful victim statement at sentencing. This happened out at Stanford. And so that book is informing some of the contributions I'm sharing with our lead, Lieutenant General B.K. Kelly, our A1 for the Air Force response to that tasker from the Secretary of Defense. So I highly recommend Know My Name for anyone, which in my mind would be everyone who is addressing sexual assault or sexual harassment in the workforce. Thanks for giving me a chance to share that.
We've been able to talk about it briefly last week, and I've got it bookmarked on my Kindle. So thank you for opening me up to that opportunity. So last September, General Charles C.Q. Brown Jr. took over as the Air Force Chief of Staff and published several strategy documents. And how has his Accelerate, Change, or Lose paper impacted the Air Force, and how has the A2, A6 responded to those 4 action orders?
Right, and so Accelerate, Change, or Lose was one of General Brown's very first actions when he took over as the Chief of Staff. And so this framework that he has set for us and is providing a strategic approach for our force going forward. There's kind of 4 central ideas that are informing the conversations we're having. Uncontested Air Force dominance is not assured. Good enough today is going to fail tomorrow. We must collaborate within and throughout the joint force to succeed. And then empowered airmen can solve any problem. And so with that framework, then he did send out the 4 action orders to provide the how. How does he envision us tackling the challenges of those 4 things I just listed? Action order A talks about airmen, the people first approach. How does the Air Force need to train and manage, retain our talent? What should we incentivize? The bureaucracy, I don't necessarily like the title of the bureaucracy action order as much, because I think it implies something different. It's really about speeding up decision making. How can we make decisions more rapidly? How can we include inputs from all of the stakeholders? As General Brown likes to say, let's have the meeting after the meeting, in the meeting. And then I would add, with all the people who need to be in the meeting. And then his competition action order is to how do we understand our competitors, their ambitions, their ways of war, how are they organizing, training, and equipping their force of the future. And then action order D is for design, the future design. How are we going to provide the nation with a flexible, affordable, congressionally supported force structure going forward? And so for A26, that has provided a perfect construct for us to focus our actions, both under the current national defense strategy that we're implementing, but also to rapidly adapt to the new administration, Secretary Austin's new guidance for us as well. I think that foundation is going to allow us to prepare our force for whichever priorities we see coming toward us in the future.
That's helpful. So I have a couple more questions of my own, but I am going to sprinkle them with our audience questions as well. Jen Sabata of Mission Tech Solutions. Hi, Jen. Jen is a former Air Force Headquarters ISR staff officer and good friend of INSA. She wants to know what are the biggest challenges facing the Air Force ISR and cyber effects operations community.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot of challenges, but I would say the short-term challenge right now is preserving our capability in our workforce, protecting our workforce through the pandemic. A lot of our workforce is being faced with significant challenges, whether it's kids that are being homeschooled, whether they're at risk, have factors that make them more vulnerable to the horrible effects of COVID. And so really shifting our mindset that we can afford the risk of some short-term reduction in productivity in order to preserve our long-term readiness and the expertise that has developed over time. And so that is, that to me is the most near-term challenge. And if I don't come up with some creative ways to address that challenge, then we will not be postured to address some of the other challenges that we're facing as well. Some of those, again, laid out in General Brown's competition action order.
That's helpful. So, we've talked a little bit about your background and how your background has impacted you as a leader. And at INSA, we've held several events over the years on the role STEM plays in future leaders of the intelligence community, as well as liberal arts. There's room for a diverse background and academic focus within the IC. But if folks will look behind you, they will see some musical notes. They will see a periodic table but it's not a standard scientific periodic table. Can you share with our virtual attendees a little bit about the meaning of both of those?
Sure. So I have a chemistry degree, and I still remember fighting to get into the intelligence career field because they didn't see how chemistry and intelligence would go together. We had to interview only, a certain number, half a dozen or so people could come in that career field. And I remember the word like analysis is analysis. And so for me, this is my periodic table of music genres, and it's a nice blend. My son and I take saxophone lessons in this room. He's been playing for years. I had a New Year's resolution about 3 years ago that I wanted to use a different part of my brain. And so now I've been taking saxophone lessons. I'm probably about a 10th grader now. So when I saw this, the periodic table of music of genres, I thought, oh, that's a perfect blend of my chemistry nerdiness with this new, foray into music and art. I do think we need all of that, the STEM and the liberal arts, in order to be successful in the work that we do.
And I think we've made great strides, but I think we still have a ways to go. There's certainly always room for improvement. So I have a question here from Marcel Lettre from Lockheed Martin. Hi, Marcel. He wants to know, how can the intelligence community best support the Air Force's contributions to joint all-domain operations? I think
right.
It's anyway, yes.
So I think the first step is going to be the data. How do we share data? How do we communicate what data we need? And then how is that data going to be easily analyzed? And multiple people are going to want to analyze the data for different reasons. The combatant commands are going to want to analyze data for near-term indications and warning, and have as much advance notice as possible. Other people are going to want to analyze the data for future trends. Where do we need to go in the future? And so that we had a great opportunity to partner with, again, General Jeff Cruz on a intelligence community JADC2, the Joint All-Domain Command and Control. And so what we found is in the Air Force, our implementation of that concept, the Joint All-Domain Command and Control concept, is through ABMS, the Advanced Battle Management System. The Army has a system, the Navy does as well. They will come together to support the JADC2 concept. What we were discovering is the 826 was supporting both for intelligence and cyber capabilities, the ABMS, and then we would talk to different parts of the IC, and they might not be as familiar with this concept and the requirements that we're going to have. So we were able, I think it was in November, to have an IC JADC2 day as part of what Jeff Cruz is calling kind of a crawl, walk, run approach to bring the IC and the services together to implement this concept. So lots of opportunities to partner, but I think the conversations are now starting to happen.
That's very encouraging to hear. And Marcel, thank you for the question. So I have a question from a student. Always like to get those. Alexander White, a student at Willamette University, asked, how is the Air Force intelligence compromised of both military and civilian personnel? So wanting to know if they're compromised with civilian and military personnel, and what role do civilians play in the ISR enterprise, and how can they join it?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I say airmen, I mean, we call that big A airmen, right? So that's the whole team. That's our enlisted, our officers, our civilian. And a lot of times I'll use the word workforce instead of that, because some people may think when I say airmen, I only mean uniform wearing. we absolutely it's a partnership between our uniform wearing and our civilians, and they serve as analysts, budget analysts, regional experts, all sorts, and same thing on the cyber side as well. And so for joining, of course, people will say, look in USA Jobs, right, to get in. And I know that that's not the most user-friendly way to do it. And so we frequently try to let people know when we're advertising jobs in USA Jobs. So for civilians, that is usually the way in. However, I also served for a time on my daughter's university's parent council, and had an opportunity to go talk to some of the juniors and seniors about careers in national security, because I know that not all of them want to join the military, but we still need that expertise. And I shared with them some of the internships that are available. Those are also in USA Jobs. If you go to DIA or NSA or NGA, you'll see them advertising for summer interns. And then they also have some programs where it's a little bit easier to join as a civilian in your first 2 years. And so I encourage you to, if you're interested in something like that, I encourage you to seek those out as well. And so again, another way to sort of speed up the process of becoming a civilian in the Air Force or in the national security community.
You
Join the Air
mentioned,
Force.
you mentioned, General O'Brien, the internships. I've been pleasantly surprised, having young people in my home from time to time as well, that, with the virtual nature of our workforce right now and within a lot of industries and the government and business, this is a great time to be able to acquire an internship without having to relocate. I've noticed, for better or worse, a lot of virtual internships. And although you miss out on that, interpersonal exchange you get in an office environment, it does open up opportunities, I think, to students and other areas who are interested in jobs in the DC area or even elsewhere. So
yeah, I agree. And one of the benefits is the cost of living for an intern, right? Indeed. So it might even allow people to apply for those opportunities who couldn't necessarily spend a summer renting an apartment in the National Capital Region.
Yeah, sometimes mom and dad's basement is just the right price if you're fortunate enough to have that accessible. So this question is from Joseph Butte. What are your thoughts on accelerating integration of commercial data and analytics into the IC, DIE, and Air Force, especially as more activities are decentralized from the big centers?
Right, and so I think that ties back to the data. One of the conversations we had both internally and during one of our Air Force NGA staff talks is people who have been in this community as long as I have grew up in an age of data scarcity. And so you would have to wait to receive information, and then you would analyze what you had, and if you didn't have what you need, you would ask for more, and you would wait, and then you would analyze. With the world today, both the information from our national sources, information available for purchase from commercial sources, and then of course data that's available, publicly available information that is available to everyone. We've been talking about how we might train our analysts in an age of data abundance and how that might lead to different TTPs, different tools. We have a lot of prioritization frameworks in order to say, well, we can't get all the data, so let's prioritize the data that we need the most. Well, what happens when you have more data? than you can handle. And so that leads to the conversations about human machine teaming, algorithms, and things like that. And so absolutely, not only integrating the data, that's just step one, but then how do we accelerate the tools that we need to give our analysts? Because the old way of downloading it into an Excel spreadsheet and then having another Excel spreadsheet and another Excel spreadsheet, you know, what I call spreadsheet hell, is not going to be effective. There's no acceleration with that kind of serial approach to data. And so we absolutely are thinking through that. How do we do our job in an age of data abundance?
And I would imagine that is a prime opportunity for collaboration with the private sector as well.
Absolutely.
So here's a question from Mark Pomerleau. And before I pose it, I just wanted to let folks know we have about 7 or 8 minutes left of Q&A. So if you all have any questions, I would encourage you to submit them. I'm doing my best to get to as many as I can. So Mark wants to know, when it comes to electronic warfare modernization, is the Air Force looking to procure new systems pods or simply modernize the current systems that are in place through software-enabled technology? Thanks, Mark.
Right, that's a great question. Unfortunately, it's a great question for our A5, Lieutenant General Q High Note, as he is doing the modernization, and our electronic warfare division is in A5L. I can share with you, I am very interested in what he's doing because he's going to have intelligence requirements for those new capabilities. And so as they're thinking through what does our modernized electronic warfare force look like, I'm asking, one, what are the intelligence requirements you have to employ that force? What are the cyber requirements you have to connect that force? And then how will we work together? And so unfortunately, that's probably about the best I can do for that one.
Perhaps we invite him as a Wednesday Wisdom or Tuesday Coffee and Conversation speaker.
I think that is a great idea.
Thank you for the recommendation. We like referrals. So Joe Kerr from BAE Systems wants to know, with the emphasis on intelligence focused on the great power competition, what enhancements does the Air Force require?
Well, so again, I think that's a really good question. I had an opportunity with my service counterparts to have a session with one of the former DNIs, and I think there'll be an opportunity with our new DNI, Director Haynes, soon. But one of the questions that General Reynolds asked is, how do we get after intelligence and competition? And so I think we are very familiar with how do we get after intelligence in conflict. It doesn't mean we have the force we need right now and prepared for the future conflict. But as we talk about conflict below, competition below the level of armed conflict, what are the intelligence requirements for that? And so with my service counterparts, we're thinking through, what does intelligence look like in competition? And I suspect it's not just a DoD challenge. How do we work together, whole of government, in that? And so we're thinking through, what does that look like? And very interested in ideas and people who want to help us solve that. We don't have all the answers in the Pentagon.
Thank you for your candid response. So here is a question from Admiral Tony Cothran. Tony, glad you could tune in today. He said, given your answer on data abundance, do you foresee creating data managers similar to today's collection manager sometime in the future?
I don't know. We've created some fellowships for data scientists. So I'll share a quick vignette. Our vice chief asked former Vice Chief General Wilson said, how many data scientists do we have in the Air Force? And the A1 people went away, and after a while they came back and they said, 423. And he said, really? And they're like, well, we don't really know, but we did a search on people who have data in their duty title. Well, that was a few years ago, and we realized we don't have data scientists to help us think through this. And so now how do we create the experts? They created the position of the Chief Data Officer with Eileen Vidrine. And so now she is in the middle of a lot of efforts to work through that. And that, that applies for our personnel system, our logistics system, our maintenance systems, as well as our cyber and intelligence requirements. And so that could be collection managers of the future might end up being some spin-off of perhaps a data scientist. We're going to need help from people who are part of INSA, industry, other creative thinkers, perhaps today's collection managers, right, who are saying, wait, this way you taught me 15 years ago is not working. I think that's definitely an intriguing concept for us to explore.
Well, so for any students tuning in, I would encourage them to explore a data science curriculum. I think that the time is now. So one final question. Here at INSA, we've created a diversity with inclusion steering committee, really to look at our organization and what we're doing to help develop and encourage a more diverse pipeline within the intelligence community, not just this year, but well into the future. Can you talk a little bit about your focus on diversity and inclusion there at the Air Force?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's clear diversity, equity, inclusion are critical to our success going forward. It's a national security imperative. It's in the D&I's principles for professional ethics. Many research studies. One of my AO says, again, my STEM background, research shows that diverse teams, are smarter, right? They focus on the facts, they process the facts more carefully, they're open to more innovative solutions, better return on investment, more efficient use of resources. So in the A26, we're addressing this in several ways. I've been fortunate to work several initiatives as the General Officer Champion for the Women's Initiative team, which is part of a SECAF-sponsored barrier analysis working group. And so taking some of the experience from being involved in those efforts, I created a diversity inclusion office in the A26 that reports directly to me. It's led by a Colonel Select and a Senior Master Sergeant. We have a draft diversity inclusion strategy that I intend to release this month. And so together, we're looking all the way from recruitment to retention of our cyber and ISR airmen, to actually look at the demographics across a career. What are the barriers that are faced along the way? As an Air Force, we've created more scholarships at historically Black colleges and Hispanic serving institutions. The training, making the training available to encourage the advanced degrees, incorporating the diversity inclusion training into our advanced skill training at Goodfellow. That's going to happen with our ISR 300 and one of our senior NTO courses, and I'd like to do the same thing on the cyber side. The other thing we're doing is sharing resources on how to get after unconscious bias. There's a great Harvard Business Review article called How the Bosses Interrupt Bias. It talks about some of those kinds of bias. The one that I've faced with most of my career since I had my children was the maternal bias, right? Once you have children, people think you're less committed to your career. I didn't have children until I was a field grade officer. But if you are committed to your career, there's a perception that you're less committed to being a good parent, which can be very hurtful. There's biases that affect our minority members as well that try to force them to conform to traditional stereotypes, ethnic stereotypes. That article has some great links to tools that they call bias interrupters, both for hiring, appraisals, running meetings. They have tools for keeping track of who interrupts who, all sorts of things. And so as part of that, our diversity strategy, we're also look at creating a minority leader program, because I don't want to just start at recruiting, right? What about the demographics of the people that we have serving today? Otherwise, we're always going to be 20 years away. And then we also been able to take advantage. I have a fellow, someone who served as a fellow in industry, and with his network, he's been bringing in some industry experts so they can share their best practices, you know, what works, what doesn't work, and why. I don't want to spend a lot of time going down the wrong path for something that's not going to produce the results we're looking for. And I feel like I have the top cover and examples in the leaders like General Brown and Secretary Austin. They've made it very clear that diversity and inclusion is going to be a priority. And I feel like A26, we're perfectly postured to follow their lead and guidance in this area.
Well, that's very encouraging. And given INSA's focus as well, perhaps there are some ways we can work together and collaborate down the road on.
I would absolutely like to do that.
These important initiatives. So really appreciate your taking the time this morning to join us on this snowy day here in Virginia, and look forward to maybe engaging you in future conversations here at INSA in the coming year.
Oh, thanks, Suzanne. It's been great to be here. I appreciate SAIC sponsoring. I appreciate INSA continuing these events under COVID conditions, and I think they're super valuable and will create the opportunity for more collaboration and partnership. Thank you very much.
You have a wonderful day.
You too.
For all of you all watching online, I just want to say thank you again for joining us, and also thank you to SAIC for their support of today's programming. Looking ahead real quick, February 11th, we'll be holding a leadership luncheon honoring new DI Director Scott Barrier. And then on February 17th, I don't have favorite children, nor do I have favorite events, but I do really enjoy this one. We will host our annual Achievement Awards ceremony, where we will be honoring 6 extraordinary early to mid-level professionals in the national security, intelligence, and homeland security communities. We're delighted that NGA Deputy Director Stacy Dixon will be joining us that evening as our keynote. And then closing out the month on the morning of February 23rd, I'm looking forward to hosting a coffee and conversation with Rita Sampson, who is the Chief IC Equal Employment Opportunity and Diversity Officer for ODNI. And then later that afternoon, our foundation, INSA does have a 501c3 foundation, will be launching the first of a 3-part series of videocast and then podcast focused on remote work trends. This first program features former NSA Executive Director Harry Coker and Advantis Federal CEO Andy Maynor. They will be participating in this moderated conversation with our partner Clearance Jobs and Senior Editor Lindy Kaiser. And then on February 24th, we will welcome Bill Lietzau, who is the Director of the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, to our Wednesday Wisdom program. Really appreciate everybody tuning in this morning. And please just take a moment, fill out our survey that's going to pop up. We really do value your feedback. And this concludes today's program. Please stay safe and healthy and have a good day.